I thought I agonized over making sure like everything was right, everything was pretty, everything was well structured, had the best dashboard, yada yada yada. People don't really care about that. What people care about is you can deliver on certain outcomes, you can check certain boxes, and that's it.
Hey nerds, Monica here. Welcome to the Data Podcast for Nerds, where we get to talk to amazing professionals and ask them all about how they're using data to solve the world's problems. We're highlighting skills that data professionals use on a daily basis. Plus, we always include some fun bits because we're all nerds here and we love to have fun. So thank you for tuning in, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. And as always, folks, happy learning. Today with us, we have Mikiko Bazeley. How are you doing today, Mikiko?
I'm doing great. Just I've got my coffee. Everything's good.
That's very important, as long as you have your coffee, right? Amazing. We start off all of our shows by understanding people's origin stories. So if you could please let us know about your background and how you got to where you are today in your career.
Yeah, totally. So, so just start with I currently lead AI developer relations for a company called Labelbox. So we're, one of the leading, if not the leading, data-centric AI platforms specifically focused on labeling annotation and data curation for unstructured data. So that's images, text, audio, video, things like that, geospatial as well. So, and I've been part of the reason why I used to do a lot more content on LinkedIn, but I've sort of paused a little bit just to kind of focus very deeply on the job, mainly because labeling annotation has sort of gone a new breath of life, really, since the whole generative AI stuff has been going on. But before I came to Labelbox to lead developer relations and technical evangelism. I did developer relations at a feature store company called Featureform, and prior to that, I've held various roles in both MLOps engineering, in data science, and data analytics. For me, I kind of tell people I'm not really. I don't consider myself self-taught. I consider myself informally taught because other than my undergrad degree in anthropology and economics, which I got from UC San Diego some years ago now, more than 10 years ago, an embarrassingly long time, right? You know, I had gotten that degree, but it wasn't really like, even at that time, it wasn't very marketable. Now I don't know how successful I personally would be in the job market. Um, but I'd gone that degree from UC San Diego, and I really had to kind of piece together my career sort of one step and building block at a time from there. So in terms of like my background, so my my parents have various degrees of schooling between them. My mom does not have a college degree. My dad has many degrees. I came from what I would say it was a middle class to lower middle class family. Most of my family is in some on the spectrum of degreedness. I have a lot of people who don't have college degrees in my family, and I have some people who have a couple, right? But almost none of them really had a background in tech or engineering or even STEM. For a lot of them, their backgrounds were in the creative arts or in like advertising or like some other domain or field like accounting, right? So when I graduated UC San Diego, I initially gone in there for a biomedical engineering degree. I I think I didn't have the right maturity and mindset to handle not just being away from home for a long time, but being at a really rigorous academic institute like UC San Diego, at least in its area of biomedical engineering. Um, so I kind of almost basically failed out. I graduated UC San Diego with like 2.6, 2.4 GPA. It was ridiculously low. I don't even remember what it is now. Um, but I ended up taking anthropology and economics as a major just to graduate, right? I needed some way to get out of the college, and they had a minimum GPA of like maybe like 2.4, 2.2, right? So I was just with all the anthropology classes and economics classes I got A's in, I just kind of was a bit able to skate by, like barely. So when I got out of the UCSD, and when I moved back to San Francisco from San Diego to then try to go job hunting, was pretty insane because I didn't have any programming skills. I didn't have any scripting skills. Uh, I'd taken like one stats class, and that I'd barely passed. So I just didn't really know what I wanted to do because I'd gone into this plan with like I'm going to go to med school and do that typical thing. But I really got quickly burned out by the stress of like my undergrad program. So I had to kind of figure out what was going on. So really kind of my career was taking just one step forward, like each sort of year. And the first year was just getting a job like at the hair salon, which at the time seemed incredibly embarrassing because I had a ton of friends who were off working in tech, or they were off working in business or finance or whatever. They were already making probably 80, 90K a year at that time. And I started working in a hair salon, and I was making like 20K a year, like in San Francisco.
Mhm.
Poverty is considered below, I think now the poverty line is considered below 70K. So, but it taught me a lot. At the time, it didn't feel really good, but it taught me a lot of skills that eventually kind of, became important when I not just became more technical in my role, but a lot more senior too. And I was dealing with, for example, the executive leadership, VP, C-level staff at like Autodesk, at um, the various kind of startups I worked at, things like that. So it was I can look back on it now and realize it was a really good gig. Taught me hard work, taught me humility, literally getting my hands dirty, stained with like stained blue with hair dye. Um, customer service, all those like really great traits that when you're younger maybe you don't really value, but when
Mhm.
you're older and you have to keep your cool because let's say for example your boss is yelling at you. Um, well, you've already dealt with like a very irate blonde customer that is unhappy about her highlights. There is almost no level of rage that could compare. I mean, the amount of rage you receive from maybe, missing your forecast by 50 to 100K is nowhere near that of a blonde who's just gotten her like highlights totally wrecked in a really bad
Yes.
session, right? So
Yes.
if you can deal with that, oh, and also knocking out Wi-Fi for the entire salon, which I did, which took down our, POS system, because I had my coffee like on the edge, then you can deal with anything in data, really. Um,
Yeah.
there's no fear like that. Like dealing with
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. So, digging more into these fun bits because I'm so fascinated about your hair salon experience.
Mm.
Hey, nerd, are you looking for a career in data? I would absolutely love to help you out. I just launched a data career strategy program that helps folks break into data without breaking anything. I provided a link in the show notes if you want to learn more information about it. Now, back to the fun bits. So, I don't know if you know this, but I actually have a blog article out there that I wrote eons ago, I don't know how many years ago, about how hairstylists can easily transfer into data because of all of these transferable skills. And so when I was reading your profile the other day, I was like, holy cow, I wonder if she knows that I have this blog post because this is like exactly the person that I want to talk to about these transferable skills.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that, but I could definitely see it because like data. many roles in data are they are kind of they are service roles, right? Or they're a service based role slash team, and there's no one that does service like a hair salon stylist, right? Or just a stylist, right? There's no one who does it better because I mean I had this one the power of good customer service hit me this one day when I saw this woman come in and she just looked like a dog dragged her through like, you know, a mud park, right? Just absolutely like a mess. Hair is obviously all over the place. You know, makeup is running and she's crying. And she had just had a tough go of it. Like something like during that week or that month, she had gone through a divorce, she'd lost her job, and then something else. It was like the trifecta of stuff that happened. And I guess all of it had hit that week. I mean, so she goes in and it was like this magic door, right? Unhappy, like, you know, poorly done haircut person goes in and out comes out smiley, happy. I'm gonna like tackle the world. Boss lady comes out. And it was just magical. And I saw that and I was like, what is going on here? So I had to experience it. And the nice thing is, the stylists they felt sorry for me because they were like, why did the manager hire you? Who are you? Like you are not our type. And one lady even said, she's like, you're not going to last here very long. And I thought that the time was kind of weird, but she had followed up with that. She's like, you're too smart for this. Like you're not going to be here for very long. And I kind of thought she was challenging me on that. I'm like, no, I'm going to last like, a couple years. And I lasted 7 months in that job. Um,
Okay.
and that was specifically, I wasn't doing the styling. I was doing the front desk work. So I was the front desk girl. I was a receptionist. So I was checking people in. I was doing their appointments, following up for billing, making sure the right customers got to the right stylist. Because that was the first time that I'd learned that in every salon, you actually have two different kinds of stylists. You have the stylists that are associated with the salon directly, and so they'll usually take all the walk-ins. And then you have the stylists that are they're independent business owners. They own their book of business, so they own their customer list. They're the stylists who have built up such a trust with their customers that, for example, I know this one this one customer, he came in. I think he was like a professional golfer, I want to say. Not any of the big names I kind of recognize, but at least well off enough that he could fly into the city 3 times a year or wherever, right? To get his haircut. Like might have been more. So he basically it might have been more. He flew in quite a bit to actually get his haircut by the same lady. So if you accidentally if you took one of their customers and gave it to like the stylist that was associated with the salon, that was like a really bad faux pas, right? So I learned a lot of these different. I learned how to kind of triage the customers that were coming in, understand kind of who went to where, understand the politics. But at the end of the day, like they were all women just trying to like kind of you know trying to move forward on their businesses. And so sometimes they would they would give each other like wash and blowouts. They would give each other like cuts and things like that. So I got to experience like, and this was a relatively well off salon. Customers that came in were usually execs or like senior people within the tech industry. So they had money. They didn't dress super well, but they had money and they projected it, and they demand a certain level of service. So I got to experience this and I was like, wow. So this is what good customer service looks like. And then they would, tell me different, ways that they would sort of like, for example, how to give someone a head massage or giving someone a shoulder massage while they're also like waiting for like their highlights or colors to set in or something like that. When you're sitting in the chair, what areas need to be clean so that the customer isn't like looking at like a dirty window, because even though it doesn't actually say anything about even though it doesn't directly impact the cut or the wash that you get, it does project a certain level of professionalism.
Hmm.
And those are just a lot of lessons that I feel like you it's not that you can't learn it in a white collar job, but you understand that in like a blue collar job, or in when you're owning your own business or things like that, the details really matter. And I think
Hmm.
in data and data science, machine learning, and engineering, details always matter. Like you, it's not always about the high level system design or architecture of a project, but sometimes it's even the like, what version of Python are we willing to support? Or how many microservices, or like how uh decoupled do we make our architecture? Or what's the trade-off between like um using like a vendor host, like using your own hosted Kubernetes, using a vendor hosted Kubernetes, or in the cases of, like, for example, Airflow, like what's the trade-offs between using self-hosted Airflow, using like a cloud hosted Airflow, versus using like a competitor to Airflow?
Hmm.
You have to make all these trade-offs, and sometimes the things that kind of like really sort of like push the deal over is these like tiny little things that seem small to you but are actually really important from the perspective of the customer or your business key stakeholders. So it was a good lesson, but it was also some hard lessons too.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So you said that you were there for 7 months.
Yeah.
At what point did you become interested in moving into the tech and data science field? Is it when like all of these tech people started coming in? You're like, I want to be that person.
Oh yeah, that was 50% of it, because the kind of the sad truth is that in the Bay Area, especially in Silicon Valley, I don't know if we really appreciate blue collar workers here, like, or like industry, like service workers as well. Like, for example, the waiter or the wait staff, or the busboy, the bus girl, or the front desk girl, right? The receptionist. And so half the time it was cool. Customers were great. But the other half the time, the customers like were I had perceived them as being very arrogant. They were kind of rude. Now, when I look back, I'm like, if you're in a hair salon, you don't want to be chatty. Sometimes you just want to read your magazine. You just want to look at your phone. You just want to kind of get into the mindset to go get your hair did. Um, but at the time I was like, yeah, but I did talk to some of these people. Like, I got a sense of like what their backgrounds were. I would ask them questions. I'm like, oh, like, what do you do? Um, what degrees do you have? Like, how did you get there? Like, kind of a similar like informational interview for each of these customers. And at a certain point, for some of these people, I'm like, why? I can do your job probably better than you can. Like, why do you have this job? Like, who are you? Like, why can't it be me? So I did have that kind of initial sort of that understanding of like, oh, well, where I am now isn't who I am going to be in the future. I think the real sort of decision point though was, because it's a small mom and pop shop. I had wanted to kind of expand the social media marketing aspect of it, and the owner was like, "We don't need to do that." She's like, "We get good enough customers as it is. We don't really need to like we don't need more people through the door." And I kind of realized at that point, I'm like, "Okay, um this is not going to be the place where I'm going to continue to grow." So kind of like that one stylist said, where she's like, "You're going to be out. Like, you're a little bit too smart." I wouldn't say I was too smart, but I was very curious and ambitious, and I wanted to like try out more. Like, it felt like a safe space, kind of learn some of the skills I needed to in order to interview well to get a job. And at especially at that time too, this was 2014. I don't remember like which startups were kind of going at that point. I remember like Sidecar, Uber and Lyft and Sidecar. There were all these like like self not ride sharing businesses, and this was really before people were like, yeah, Uber and Lyft are going to be the winners, right?
Mhm.
So there was that going on. it was just like a really kind of expansive time for startups. And something I'd started doing was I started taking lessons and social dancing lessons. So I would interact with a lot of these people who worked at Google or like any of the big techs, and also people who worked in startups. So I made the decision to, I'm like, I just want to get into the startup space.
Mm.
I'm not super picky in terms of like what startup I use to make that entrance into the startup space, but I know I want to go in there. So I took a look around, found this site, which at the time was called AngelList. Now it's called WellFound, and I would just apply to jobs. Finally got one with an HR tech recruiting company or recruiting startup. That also lasted about 7 months as well, because eventually they pivoted. And that was like the first lesson in the just how challenging startups can be. Like
Hmm.
startups are not the place you go to get rich quick.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
they're like a super long grind, usually of at least like 6 years. If you get in early and you want to kind of build up that equity and also make sure the startup actually succeeds.
Mhm.
But it is a place to go where if you want to learn a lot in a short period of time, that's why you go to a startup.
Yep.
You never go for the like, is it going to be big? Is it going to pay a lot of money? Startups nowadays, there was a point where startups paid more, but nowadays startups will kind of pay about par with big tech. Um, so it's really you go for the learnings. And so that's kind of what I did was that, each kind of startup job that I took, and there's about three of those, I would sort of inch my way closer to the analytics space. The first one,
Okay.
I was working as like a sales ops growth hacker kind of person. The next
Oh,
one,
okay.
I did biz ops for an antivirus company. And then the job after that was I finally got like my first data analyst job working for the finance team, the part of it that was focused on sales marketing analytics for a company called Sunrun, which is like the largest residential solar company in the US. Um, I just kind of like eventually inched my way into the data analyst field
Okay.
before I finally transitioned to doing like data sciencey work at Autodesk, focused on their
Okay.
production suite.
Okay. So how was the first entrance though into the tech space from being a receptionist? Like what kind of skills did you have to leverage to get your foot in the door so that you could inch your way into data science?
Yeah, so let's see. So the so actually the first take home for that job, so it was a do analysis using R or Python. I didn't know any programming languages. I kind of sort of knew R a little bit. So I had a friend from UCSD who helped me out a lot with that take home assignment, where he actually gave me some sample code. And this was, oh my god, did we have R Studio? This was back when R Studio was in really rough shape. We didn't even have an R Studio, not really. Um,
Ah.
this was back when people were using the R email lists to learn R.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was, yeah. So when I told, when you and I were in Charleston, and I told people I used R way back in the day. I mean, way back in the day. Because that was my first take home assignment that I did. So I was analyzing some data from Salesforce uh, to like, do a data viz story. I did that. It wasn't that impressive to them, actually.
Hmm.
They were like, we just needed to know that you had enough skills. But what had impressed my manager at that time, who eventually she went on to become, she was like employee number 100 at HubSpot or something like that. And she eventually went on to become a VP at several different companies that, like, I think the second to last one focused on like ABM marketing, account based marketing. Uh, so she was much more inspired by how gritty I was, because my resume just looked like an absolute mess. An absolute mess. My interviewing skills were okay, but her kind of criteria she had told me was one, she liked that I had a good personality and that I conveyed myself well. I wasn't necessarily trying to like oversell myself because at the end of the day, if you have gaps in your resume, you have gaps in your resume, right?
Yep.
Um, but she liked talking with me and she was trying to hire for a sales team, but then once she kind of saw the take home, she's like, okay, she's like, you have enough kind of skills. You can probably do some stuff on the sales ops side. And then I would just ask a lot of good questions. And, she was hiring for a fairly junior role. So at that time, she was like, you know what, this is good enough. You're willing to work for the budget that we had. At that point, I obviously didn't know how to negotiate. So that role was like a 40K role. I think. So it was a little bit of a step up, but not really. It was just enough of a step up that I could rent a bedroom from a friend who had like in kind of an illegal in-law unit in San Francisco.
Okay.
So she was renting like an in-law unit in the bottom of a house. So she
Yeah.
she rented out her closet to me, basically. The room that was like 2 or 3 times bigger than a closet. So just enough money to do that, but not enough money for anything else, right?
Hmm.
So but once I got into that job, I kind of quickly, I would pick up skills, right? I would sort of, I wouldn't say no to projects. I would anything my manager gave me, I would just go do it. But I also started learning outside. So because we're using Salesforce at that time, and once again, this was early Salesforce, so this was back when they said they had their whole positioning of, you know, we're like a cloud free, or we're like an on-prem, or we're on-prem free or cloud based like CRM. And the
Hmm.
internet was constantly going out, which means we couldn't use Salesforce half the time,
Yeah.
right? But I started learning Salesforce on the side, was building towards like the certification at that time. So I just learned whatever I could to do my job better, and I just kind of expanded out like to like the adjacent areas.
Hmm.
So that included growth hacking, that included email marketing, that included a little bit of SEO, SEM, that included in like doing like Salesforce reporting, things like that, right?
Yeah.
So like that was the and it's funny because a lot of my I keep kind of in some ways going back to sales and marketing in a lot of my roles, whether it was like working as a data analyst, data scientist, things like that. Like I ended up just working a lot with um sales, marketing, customer success, finance, all like rev ops. And it really kind of started with that first like role that I had
Yeah.
in the startup world.
Yeah, that's awesome that like I see this a lot with my guests and even myself that throughout your career you kind of do circle back to earlier skills that you've had or
Yeah.
earlier like passions that you've had just because they always do stick around. So it's kind of cool to see throughout like everyone's careers. So while you're going through your career, obviously you have to learn new things all the time to keep stepping up, to keep upskilling and whatnot. What would you say are your go-to resources for when you're approaching something new?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it just depended on the domain, right? So when I was moving into more of the data analytics data science world, I'd found a couple of sites I'd used were Data Camp was one. Um, what else? Data Camp. I'd taken some classes at the local community college, JC. Coursera was a big one. When I moved more into the MLOps engineering side, those same the resources that I found much more useful were having the O'Reilly subscription was great. Um, having a subscription to educative.io because they have a couple good like system design courses on there. And then I did the springboard boot camp for both the data science and a little bit for the MLOps pivot. And then finally doing a lot of like workshops like in-person workshops in the Bay Area. So the one I done that had kind of helped me make that pivot into MLOps was the full stack deep learning course. They have a ton of free material that they're constantly posting. Those are the ones I definitely found a lot more useful than, like the other ones that I was using for the data analyst, data science side. Now there's just so many resources really that I feel like you kind of can't go wrong. I've seen a lot of free courses on Maven. LinkedIn Learning has some courses. It looks like something that I do kind of struggle with though is it's pretty easy to just do courses and tutorials and to kind of get stuck in tutorial hell. So that's kind of where I have had to force my have had to discipline myself to focus more on like building work,
Hmm.
because at the end of the day, like that's my current job, but also that was like just all my past jobs was can you kind of ship code according to like the specs that you're given. Everything else like education, building community, things like that, those are important now in the DevRel field for me, but having good technical content, especially end to end projects, that really kind of matters a lot more than
Yeah.
really kind of anything else. So that's what I am personally trying to focus more on is actually kind of like reeling back my subscriptions and either just keeping like two or three that I think are like the most valuable,
Hmm.
and then just trying to build out projects.
Yeah. That's a good point. That was me in 2020. I just went all crazy on taking all of the courses and not really building out too much. I had a few things here and there, but definitely something that I could have focused more on. That way I had something more of like a project portfolio type thing to share out with others, other than like, hey, look at all of these certificates of completion that I have, right? Because that's like, okay, so you took a course, but how did you apply it to something?
Oh yeah, totally. Like yeah, Udemy was another site where I just racked up lists of courses that I purchased and then like never actually did. So it's always funny when I do see like I've been guilty of this too, but when I see a lot of like LinkedIn posts where it's like here are like 20 or 30 courses, and I'm just like there's no one that's disciplined enough. Like the number of people who will look at that list and then actually go do all that stuff is like 1%. Like
Mm-hmm.
realistically, maybe like 50 to 60% of people will do like one uh on the stuff of 50, right? Um but yeah, like no one has time to no one has time to do all the courses in the world. And so a book that I really have enjoyed reading and I try to kind of really sort of what's the term? Um that I try to embody is the ultra. So there's this book called Ultra Learning. It was by this guy who had done like the MIT Computer Science Challenge,
Yeah.
where he'd gone through the MIT open courseware, like all the free videos and uh, syllabi that they have and lectures, and he had tried to see if he could self teach, if he could self study through 4 years of the MIT computer science curriculum.
Okay.
So he had done the study, and then he'd also grade himself based on the exams and things like that, right? So, and he did this in like 2 years or something. Now it's he readily admits that it's questionable how good of a computer scientist he really is at after that, because at the end of the day, like there's what you're taught in like your CS undergrad program, and there's what you're actually able to produce out in industry. Um, and he also didn't have anyone to kind of really like review his code. Now it'd be like way easier to do that with like co-pilots and things like that. But at the time he didn't. But it I think spurred a lot of people's sort of interest and imagination in terms of, like how valuable is like paying however many thousands of dollars to like the undergrad universities, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he eventually created a book that was sort of based off his learnings doing that project and a few others. called Ultra Learning, and it basically gives a framework for how do you learn new stuff in a structured, fast way, leveraging stuff like projects.
Yeah.
And so I personally I love that book. Um, I feel like in my career with all the different pivots I did, I've developed I kind of like converged on some very similar principles and kind of create my own playbook of doing pivots. Um, but it's a good book. I think that like everyone should read, especially if they're trying to pivot to like a different area in tech. Because I think a lot of times, like when you see people talk about pivoting, they kind of give you this like 1 year plan. And I think realistically, a lot of times people could pivot into a new role in probably like 3 to 6 months. Like,
Hmm.
and if you're like really sort of motivated and you really kind of nail down like the 80/20 of the skills that you're missing, you could probably get down to like four. Right. Now, you won't be like, you wouldn't have mastered the new field that you're going into. I don't think there's any way to do that. But you could, for example, switch jobs
Yeah.
and at least like get started like in a new area, like going from data analyst to data scientist or going from the business side to data analytics.
Hmm.
Like I don't think the pivot is usually, it doesn't need to take a year to
Yeah.
make that pivot.
Yeah. That's true. Do you have any other recommendations or maybe words of encouragement for the audience members?
I'd say there's a couple resources I would recommend. So one book, so I think something that people don't necessarily do well is they don't know how to self promote like their work. So I think that's something that like everyone can kind of work on. I know I like have a lot there I could work on. But especially if folks want to like promote themselves on social media, one book I would really recommend is Nicholas Cole's The Art and Business of Online Writing. I
Okay.
thought this was like a really solid book because it kind of breaks down what is like, good copywriting looks like. Uh Another book I'd sort of recommend, especially for people who are trying to do like freelance consulting, is The Consulting Bible. Joe Reese actually recommended this book to me, and he's like, this is a book he wished he'd had uh back when he was like just getting started. A couple others are um there's one that's like the missing engineer's handbook. That's a really, really
Huh.
great book, especially for people who didn't go through like a traditional CS program. Um, I thought that was a fantastic book. It when you combine that with the missing CS semester from MIT, you get a really good introduction to like just basic 101 engineering skills and programming skills. Um, those are like the three that are at the top of my head in terms of like really good resources. In terms of like words of encouragement, so I'd given a talk recently for Tina's boot camp on agents, but specifically on the idea that uh, are you late to machine learning and generative AI like right now? Like, and is it worth building like agents from scratch when you can use like a drag and drop tool, right? And so, what I would tell folks, if they're kind of, if they have any sort of anxiety around generative AI like replacing their jobs, I would, you know say a couple things. Like, one, we're a really far way from generative AI replacing anyone's job. So even some of the demos that have been out there in terms of like the virtual or the autonomous like software engineer sort of type demos, a lot of those tend to be cherry picked, and it's questionable how great the code is that's produced. Like, does it work? Sure, but a lot of things can work in like a POC or sandbox environment that will not scale up once you get to like, for example, 10,000 users are trying to access your app. Like, what do you do?
Yep.
Right? Or let's say, for example, you need to like like fine tune or retrain your model. Like, what do you need to do? Let's say, for example, you need to make sure your data is like great quality. What do you need to do? Right. So there's all these concerns that you can kind of just like sort of, hide when it's like
Mhm.
just a personal project or a toy app, but they kind of come into play when you're sort of actually like building a real product. Right. So I don't think generative AI is going to take anyone's job yet. Um, but I do think people should have like a very healthy respect and understanding for how they can leverage generative AI tools to like do work that to automate work that isn't really kind of valuable. Something that when I was a junior, I thought people wanted the best quality work. I agonized over making sure like everything was right, everything was pretty, everything was well structured, had the best dashboard, yada yada yada. People don't really care about that. What people care about is you can deliver on certain outcomes, you can check certain boxes, and that's it. So if you want to like waste your time kind of trying to do everything from scratch, that's great. But if you are willing to kind of incorporate generative AI tools, so for example, for some of the copywriting I do, I will use or even the blogging or whatever, I will use like Claude or like ChatGPT or the various different LLMs. I will use them to draft up an initial outline.
Yeah.
I might kind of put down my bullet point of ideas. I'll use it to draft an outline. I'll use it to generate questions that I should address in the blog post. I might use it to do some initial research, but what I found personally is doing like manual research is actually just much more effective. And then using, for example, an LM to summarize the paper or to find like the most salient sort of points for me to like evaluate whether or not this is a resource I want to incorporate, right? Um, Doing that honestly has saved me like like hours of time. So a process that could normally take 50 hours, it would have saved me at least like 20, 30 hours,
Wow.
which is more time I could spend on higher quality projects, on higher value initiatives, things like that. So those are kind of
Absolutely.
like 2 points I'd say. Like one is don't worry about generative AI taking your job, but also number two, like don't stick your head in the ground and like ignore it. Another example of how, I think generative AI tools can be used very effectively, especially in interviewing or career building is so like my partner, for example, is had to do like a refresh on his resume, on his LinkedIn profile, on everything. And when I read the resume, there was so much stuff that had to be changed. I was really struggling to kind of articulate like why is why is there such what are all the gaps between the
Mhm.
job that he wants and the resume that he has. So what we did is I said, hey, I was like, hey babe, okay, first off, like pull up like 10, 15 jobs that you like really like these are the jobs that you want. So we did that, right? Then I'm like, okay, great. Now copy paste or use like the custom GPT or whatever we did. I was like, okay, great. Now get ChatGPT to summarize a couple things. Like one, what is the most common list of responsibilities that they're looking for? What's the most common list of experiences? What are the skills? And more importantly, are there like key terms or key sort of key language tone that they're using, right?
Mhm.
Language tone, language style, things like that that we want to emulate in your resume,
Yep.
right? So we did that. Then we're like, okay, great. Now let's use ChatGPT. What would a resume targeted at this kind of job look like? So we did that. Then we're like, okay, great. Now let's feed in your resume and let's just do a comparison. Like, what is missing
Yep.
between your resume and that job description? And he was able to like spit out a list of like 20 different bullet points of all the things he needs to fix, right?
Yeah.
So we did that, and we were like, okay, great. Now let's start digging into like what is your list of projects. So we built up a Google sheet of all the different projects, all the work that he worked on by like the project name, the business value, the key stakeholders, lessons learned, things like that. And then once again, we ran it through ChatGPT. We're like, okay, how would you articulate this in a like where each bullet point is a I did X using like Y tools to accomplish Z business outcome.
Mhm.
And then from there, like normally this process would have taken us probably like, who knows? It would have taken us a couple weeks manually, back and forth, arguing,
Oh,
going like,
absolutely.
well, you're in machine learning. You aren't in advertising. How would you know what this is? And I'm like, I don't know what it is. Right. But instead we were able to use this to facilitate what is normally like a very painful process. And his resume looks awesome. His LinkedIn is gonna look even more awesome because I'm gonna help him with it, right? But um, as a designer, he had been kind of a little bit nervous about using generative AI tools, but now he's like, okay, I can use it for these things, like building up a resume, but for the actual project work that he cares about, which is like, visual design, animation, things like that, he can still create his own IP.
Mhm.
He doesn't have to outsource his like the creative aspect of his
Yeah,
job. He just outsources the stuff that he doesn't like. And he's really happy with that, right? So yeah, I mean, so I would say like, definitely people should not be afraid of using the tools, whether they're like in design or like engineering, because they're just honestly just very helpful.
absolutely. That was a really, really good use case. Thank you
It was
for
a fun
sharing that.
process. It was a fun process. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I bet. I bet. Well, thank you so very much, Mikiko, for being on the show with us. If any of the audience members have questions for you, where can they find and or follow you?
Yeah, so they can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, now known as X. I'm still going to call it Twitter. I'm also on TikTok, Instagram, GitHub, you name it. They just need to look for Mikiko Bazeley, the MLops Engineer, and they should be able to find me.
Amazing. Well, thank you again, Mikiko. And as always, folks, happy learning.